Beep, 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 yeah! Baby You Can Drive My Car from the Rubber Soul album and Ticket to Ride from Help are among my favourite Beatles songs. Unfortunately, these songs, fantastic as they are, were to be the unwitting soundtrack to my first racist incident. This was not the Beatles' fault. I was still in junior school, but in 1966 the Beatles had problems of their own. In 1966, the mood in America was starting to sour even for them. The States were slowly becoming embroiled in the Vietnam War, and the American press had a habit of asking entertainers like the Beatles for their political and philosophical opinions. The Beatles sensed a trap. On a more trivial level, American musicians were complaining that they couldn't get work anymore because of the British invasions, of course led by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, Dave Clark 5, Herman's Hermits. They loved Herman because he actually sung with a British accent. American bands were now reduced to giving themselves pseudo-British sounding names like the King's Men or the Buckinghams to disguise their American origins. Even the Mighty Birds were taking Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man and a song called Turn, Turn, Turn and recording them as if they were Beatles songs. Then the biggest Beatles controversy struck. An interview in March 1966 with Maureen Cleave of the London Evening Standard, where John Lennon had said, "We're, i.e. the Beatles, more popular than Jesus now. I don't know what will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." In the UK, the whole interview virtually went unnoticed. Tomorrow's fish and chip paper. But when the interview crossed the Atlantic, all hell broke loose. The Beatles were accused of blasphemy. The Ku Klux Klan became very agitated. They'd already noticed that the Beatles had refused to play to segregated audiences in the South. The KKK threatened to assassinate John Lennon and the Beatles. Radio stations were refusing to play Beatle records. There were Nazi-like mass burnings of Beatle records. And there was even a strange rumour that the Beatles had run into trouble in Canada because the Canadians thought Ringo looked suspiciously Jewish. At one open-air Beatle gig, there was a loud bang. All the Beatles turned around expecting to see Lennon's body on the floor, but it was just some drizzle that got into the amp. So my problems in junior school, by comparison, were minor. As I said in the previous video, being the only black kid in class in an English school was not as onerous as people assumed. I expected one day I'd be called a name or someone would be waiting for me after school. But my first racist incident came from a completely different source. In my infant mind, my Uncle Reggie was like the black version of the film star Robert Mitchum, Mr. Macho Man, then some. I was amazed one day when he turned up with an American car that somehow he imported into the UK. How could he afford this? He was only a factory worker. He even had a radio in it, imagine. And on this radio, it played my favourite Beatles songs. Baby You Can Drive My Car and Ticket to Ride. At the time, a typical British car looked like this. A typical French car looked like this. While an American car looked like this. A typical British car, typical French car, a typical American car. Not only was the car an undiluted American car only seen in Hollywood films and American superhero comics, it was also a convertible. And not one of those European convertibles with a canvas top. This one had a fully automated metal roof that packed into boot. In the 1960s, the streets were relatively empty of traffic, especially on a Sunday, and in no time at all, we were at Big Ben, and yes, the Beatles were playing on the radio. When we stopped at traffic lights facing the Houses of Parliament, we implored our Uncle Reggie, please take the roof down. Like something straight out of James Bond, he pressed the button on the dashboard, and my brother and I were mesmerised as the roof slowly packed itself into the boot behind us. Wow. Then I became aware of a new and unpleasant feeling. I looked up and I looked around. Pedestrians and people in the car adjacent were staring. These were not the glances of interest or intrigue. It was hatred. Instinctively I knew black people in the 1960s were not meant to be juxtaposed with such luxury. I found the whole thing so unnerving, I didn't ask the other people in the car if they'd noticed the stairs. I just wanted the roof to finish packing itself into the boot so we could use the big American engine to get the hell out of there. How do I know the stairs were a matter of misinterpretation? Well, I've got to this ripe old age and I've never felt that intensity of feeling again. We drove home in silence, just listening to the radio. Meanwhile, in America, the Beatles were not to know it, but their days of live performance was coming to an end. In the Philippines, there'd be another unpleasant incident. The Beatles therefore didn't respond to an invite from the president's wife, Imelda Marcos, and again, all hell broke loose. Beep, 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 yeah!